I guess the question I wanted to start off with, and it's a very broad question, is what are the mineral commodities that we don't have these hidden stockpiles all around the world for? Like, are there any that are truly rare that if you had disruption, everything would grind to a halt? Or are most of them just like China processes them, so like there's shortages in the supply chains, but none of this stuff is truly rare? Is that question too broad, or does that make sense?
No, that's a really, really good question. So it's a two-parter, I'd actually argue. So the first is, what is truly rare? And so now we're talking about, elements or metals or materials where the crustal abundance is just minuscule, but they're critical for what we do in our everyday lives. So that is really boils down to, I'd say, one class of materials, your platinum group metals. You can make arguments for a couple of others, but the ones that, like, if the supply were to dry up instantly and we all hurt, it's those guys. And you can actually track that too, because I want to say a couple of years ago, this would have been 2010, there was disruption at the mines in South Africa, which is a good chunk of the world's supply. Depending on which of the elements depending on which of the PGMs, there's 6, your platinum, your palladium, rhodium, and 3 others. Depending on which one, that can be anywhere from 50% of the market to 85% of the market. And once those mines stopped operating properly, those prices spiked instantly. It was overnight. In comparison, you've got another low crustal abundance element, or I'd say a rarer one, maybe not to the same criticality as the PGMs, but beryllium, where there's really only 2-3 mines in the world that do all the heavy lifting. If those mines go down for a little bit, the criticality, it's not immediate. You'll get there eventually, but you don't see a price spike, or suddenly you don't go, oh no, we're out of beryllium. It's like, okay, there's enough supply to last us for at least a little while. So that's problem one. What is truly rare? Problem two is, okay, outside of the rarity, let's talk grade. How much of a certain material is actually in a deposit itself? So this is more something that the rare earths are in. This is something that gallium actually is as well. Gallium is reasonably abundant compared to some others, but it's in such fine quantities everywhere that actually getting a concentrated enough deposit to effectively go after, that's the hard part.
I know a little bit about what PGMs are used for, but so just sticking on the first part of that question for a second. So what are PGMs critical for, and what is beryllium critical for? Because I have no idea what beryllium is critical for.
Yeah. So the PGMs, the one that everyone knows, catalytic converters. If you have an internal combustion engine, it has PGMs in some manner or form. It's also used for really exotic applications. So spark plugs, you're basically having explosions in your engine. It has to withstand that, so that's what it's used for. Another one is specialty catalysts to make certain plastics, and also to do what's called catalytic refining. In the petroleum industry, you need either platinum, iridium, or some combination. Every group has their own variation of it. We've been doing it since the 1940s, basically. And so it's used as catalyst for those types of specialty reactions. Thinking forward, a lot of your hydrogen production, it's going to be reliant on that, especially if we are looking at using what are called the proton exchange membrane hydrogen cells. Those are totally dependent on PGMs. The real stickler there is the iridium. And I think, CI actually has a report out on that. The fact that iridium is just so rare. And then you throw platinum on the other side, your anode is iridium, your cathode is platinum based. So if those disappear overnight, that whole cell of chemistry is just basically non-functional at that point. And then there are some other specialty electrolytic applications, specifically for carbon sequestration, that the majority of those materials are all platinum iridium based. So that whole supply chain dries up if you run out of them or if you lose the availability. Beryllium's a little bit more interesting. Beryllium basically is limited to a handful of industries. It's not as widespread, but so for nuclear industries, it has use applications in both fission and fusion. The big application right now that everyone's looking at in the future for fusion reactors is beryllium is used in something called FLiBe. It's a molten salt that's used to thermally regulate and to also help deal with a ton of the electrical currents that could potentially develop in a fusion system. Miles can talk about that a lot more than I can in much more detail. But needless to say, it's something that the future applications are being designed with an open source of beryllium in mind, especially with all of the fusion reactors that people are looking to make, unless the technology differs, of course. The other thing is more currently, it's used in aerospace, very high strength, very lightweight applications, as well as satellites. It's a very, very good, robust material. It is somewhat toxic to humans, so procuring it and handling it is quite difficult. But for those extreme applications where nothing else will suffice, yeah, you'll figure out a way to work with the beryllium.
And PGMs are Russia and South Africa, if memory serves. Are there other big deposits? And then where are beryllium deposits in the world?
So with regards to the PGMs, there is one other deposit of note. That's actually in the U.S. It's in Montana. The Nye complex, it's called. As for beryllium, that actually is a material that is almost exclusively processed by the U.S. in terms of both the mining and the refining. So that is done in Utah. I want to say it's Juba Canyon. It's a subsidiary of Materion. And then the Chinese also have some processing capability and mining capability. That is the Xinjiang mining group. I can verify that later, but there is one in Western China that I know is currently operating. The refineries, they're more scattered about. And then I know because of the potential for nuclear applications, Russia used to have a beryllium mine, but they closed it down in the early 90s, if I'm not mistaken. But now, because the demand for nuclear and for clean energy is beginning to ramp up again, they're looking at reopening that mine.
Interesting. Well, if we turn to another metal that we already mentioned, and I wanted to ask you about gallium and germanium in particular, but what I wanted to ask you is, you're part of a mining startup, you're in this space. Simplistically, I sit here and I, say, oh, well, if China's going to cut off gallium and things like that, where is gallium? The U.S. had a mine in Utah that had both gallium and germanium that apparently hasn't been producing it since the mid-1980s. And I think, oh, well, and Tech Resources, I believe, the Canadian mining company now owns that mine right now. And you think, oh, well, maybe they're going to do well, or maybe this is going to be a boon for them if China really does cut it off. But the thing about China is that, they've ascended to such a dominant position in all these mineral commodities because they were willing to do things more cheaply and at an environmental cost that nobody else was willing to bear. And I was just wondering, at what point does gallium actually become profitable for a company to actually start mining and refining in the United States? Are we even close to that? Is it good for Tech Resources that it technically owns the real estate where they used to do all these things? Or does it really not matter and we're not even really close to bringing some of this production out of China into other parts of the world? The Trump administration established tariffs on all these metals and materials in 2018, and you still haven't seen a huge shift.
Yeah, so with regards to gallium, that one's a little tricky. And that's primarily because, yes, tech may have the resources, but when you actually look at the full consumption and the profitability associated with those materials, it's probably a drop in their bucket unless they are heavily, heavily focused on that. So, for instance, gallium typically is gotten from bauxite residue. It's a bauxite residue, red mud. It's also called, it's a waste from the aluminum process, from aluminum oxide processing, the Bayer process. And because the volumes of that are so large, you can, in effect, get a large amount of gallium just through sheer volume. The recoveries, to my understanding, they're decent, anywhere between 35 and 50%, depending on which process you actually use. But again, when you process 150 million tons of this material, statistically speaking, you're going to get a large amount of gallium out of there. So it's a bit of a numbers game. If China were to truly cut it off, before we look at domestic resources, candidly, I'd start looking at who else can produce the byproducts or produce the materials that gallium is then typically sourced from, and in what quantity. So for something like gallium, I'd actually be looking at somewhere like Brazil. I'd be looking at somewhere like Australia, because their bauxite processing is on a scale that we in the US can't even contend with right now. So as a result of that, if the gallium sourcing became that much of an issue, yeah, tech could go after it. But if it's something that is much easier implemented on a bauxite source, so again, a red mud situation, then I could see the Brazilian and the Australian sources actually being more viable before going back and looking at what tech has. Now, for the germanium, that's another story. Tech does actually do quite a bit of germanium, and that is their specialty. So they've got the technical base on top of that. So going after the germanium, I can see being a lot more easy because they are the specialists in it and because they have the resource for it. I don't think the same could be said for gallium, again, just because of the sheer amount of materials that are processed to get that stuff sometimes.
And correct me if I'm wrong, germanium is a byproduct of zinc, or it's usually found in zinc deposits? I wasn't exactly clear on the relationship between zinc and germanium.
It's a byproduct typically of zinc mining. Zinc or other sulfides, in principle, you can get it out of lead as well, but the favorability of lead mining nowadays is just not big here in the US and or Europe. So again, you can get it in principle. You want to get it from a zinc deposit. You want to get it from a sulfide deposit that doesn't have lead, that doesn't have arsenic, that doesn't have cadmium. But the practicality of that's a little bit trickier.
When China announced those export controls, as you might expect, my phone blew up. So clients and media sources and things like that asking me questions about it. What does this mean, and how are we going to think about our supply chains and yada yada yada. From where you sit, like in a mining startup, did it even register? Was it that's ancillary? Like that's not going to be related to anything that we do? Did you stop in your tracks and be like, potential opportunity? Like how does somebody who's in the mining sector think about those types of announcements?
For someone as small as us, for about 48 hours, it was something that we were just getting phone calls, emails, everything like, where is this? Where can you get it from? So the feedback there was just immediate. I can say from the larger mining side, it's not something they particularly focus on. If they had a real incentive structure, they'd go do it. But again, the bottom line of an efficient gallium production facility versus running the status quo and trying to increase your capacity in a material that you can process larger volumes of, the revenue just totally outweighs the gallium. Mm-hmm. Again, if the geopolitical situation though calls enough for, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine, then the deal can be made. But for the smaller groups, it's a pretty big thing.
Yeah. The last question I had, and then I would love to hear what you said. You had some things you wanted to bring up as well, but the thing that caused you to reach out initially was my flippant comments about lithium and in Kashmir. And listeners have probably gotten a little bit of a taste of why I'm increasingly skeptical of lithium, just because I don't really see how electric vehicles scale globally, and it feels like we're finding all these different lithium reserves, and it, just like there's just one bullish story about lithium that everybody's banging, and I get really skeptical when everybody's talking and saying the same thing. But what are your views on lithium? Do you think I'm being too skeptical? Do you share some of that skepticism there? I mean, it really does seem like it went from being this super rare thing to now everybody has it. Now everybody's talking about refining and processing it, and just seems like a classic boom bust situation to me.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of lithium, you're wholly dependent on the electric vehicle market and or just the general electrification market. As a whole, I would say everyone now is finding lithium. That's not terribly surprising. Do I think it's overblown? Yeah, to an extent. I don't have a good enough, I don't have the crystal ball. I don't have a good enough gauge to see what true EV consumption is like, but I'll pair the two together generally 1-to-1 because the lithium ion battery is basically what we're dependent on. Outside of that, what I think needs to also be thought of as well is that it's not just that you found lithium, it's what form it comes in. There's brines, there's spodumene, a couple of other more exotic lithium minerals. Well, okay, you've got this fantastic deposit. Fine. how do you get it out? Are you even permitted to get it out? There's a great example fairly recently of a group in Chile, and they had this fantastic ion clay deposit. And make a long story short, they didn't do their environmental permitting process, or something got mucked up, and they were denied their license. Mm-hmm. They were denied the ability to continue doing development and exploration. So, okay, you've got the deposit, but can you actually do anything with it? That's typically, for me, the harder part in some cases. Another good example is the Kiruna mine. The Kiruna mine in Sweden. It's an old iron ore mine. It's been operating for hundreds of years. And they just found rare earths. I'll put that one in quotes. They've known about the rare earths for over 150 years. Maybe not had all the details on it, but they've known about it. I mean, the rare earths were originally found in Ytterby, Sweden, or at least that general vicinity. So the geology is clearly there. I think the question everyone needs to ask is, what's the grade? Because when we think about all these new deposits, we've got maps, we've got geologists, we've had explorers who've been combing this earth for 100, 200 plus years. And one of the difficulties is that, they'll find the original rock and they'll say, hey, maybe we found something here. But at the same time, you have to take a step back and recognize that, yes, we found the rock. Yes, we found a potential source, but how good is it? What's the availability? Is it so far out that the deposit just can't get infrastructure? That's always a big thing too. So, the lithium in Kashmir, they've known about that since the 1990s. Mm-hmm. If you probably had a geologist and a petrologist look at it enough, they'd say, yeah, this rock is from this era. This was under ocean water. This was, stratified rock. They can get you a pretty good idea in most cases what's supposed to be in there. So this whole we found new deposits, it's a little misleading in my opinion. I do understand you have to drum up interest, you have to drum up support for these kinds of projects because they're major infrastructural projects. At the same time though, the ability to get a useful material does bring a lot of interest in. You just have to pair expectations with what reality looks like in some cases.
Well, and to your point about India, I mean, they had to modify a law back from 1957 to approve commercial mining of lithium and a few other elements. So I think to your point, it was probably a well-timed announcement so that they could justify changing the law rather than it working the other way.
Yeah, and I mean, it's something here that we face in the U.S. too. The U.S. still has historical laws on the books where there's a permitting process for small scale miners on federal land where literally you stake the ground. That's still a thing. Does that mean that, overhauls have to be done? Well, it depends on who you ask and what their interests are. At the same time though, to get a fully developed project of that nature, you might have to work with the legislature. You may have to work with the forces that have power at the time to get something that's more favorable for a larger project. Because I don't think staking the ground will, help build a kilometer-long mine vein or assembly facility.
Well, yeah, and I mean, to your point, shout out to my friend Charlie, who's an avid listener of the podcast and who was regaling me with some stories about Minnesota and copper mining and how, there's a couple operations or potential mines up there that have been in the works for literally years now, and they can't get the permits through to kind of start going. And it's just about you wait until the situation is dire enough to where government decides to sort of lower the threshold at which you need to issue the permits or to not let bureaucracy sort of muck everything up. And it just seems like we're not quite there yet. Like we're not really taking that seriously, even if it is a big buzzword and topic these days. Yeah.
Well, there's an interesting compounding effect too, where I'd say in the U.S., another thing to take into consideration is, do we even have the technological base to do some of these things properly? When we offshored mining and metallurgy roughly 40 years ago, our technology in a sense has kind of gotten stuck in time. So there are certain materials and certain operations that you can go to the textbooks and you can find out, hey, yeah, it supposedly works this way, whereas the rest of the world may have moved on from that original method. I'm remembering speaking with with someone, and he was talking about how they would recover antimony. And antimony is a co-product of lead mining. And so what they would do is they would literally just get a giant cauldron of lead, heat it up until it's liquid, and just start stirring it, and then throw in hunks of sodium metal. And the sodium metal would react with the antimony and give you a scum that you would clean off, and then you can refine that to antimony. But you tell someone that, hey, yeah, we're going to go get antimony right now, go get the lead cauldron, go get the sodium blocks. Getting a permit for something like that is not trivial. Could it be done? Yes. But the question I always ask myself is, how much pushback are you going to get both from the local populace, because the social license to operate in the U.S. is a huge thing that people overlook, followed by just the technological, do we even know how to do this properly anymore? Because I explained the process in broad sweeping strokes. But I guarantee you that with like a lot of these processes, there's always a few details that if you get it right, it's the difference between a profit-bearing operation and one that will never bear any fruit.
Is it fair to say that China is at the cutting edge of all of this stuff? Are there other countries that we should be thinking about? Is it also fair to say that like the United States could learn fairly quickly, or is that not realistic?
So a couple of ways that this question is answered. The first is, it depends on the metal, and it depends where you are in the process, right? So some of the best metallurgists in the world for your rare earths, for your critical materials, they're Chinese. Why? Because they've been working with these systems for 30 plus years, and they're the only ones who've been willing to take the environmental penalty but continue to innovate and work with those systems. There's other materials that arguably the Russians are the best. Aluminum is one of them. Their refinery operations to actually make the aluminum metal, some of the more advanced ones, as well as a lot of work that the Soviet Union did before the fall in the late 80s, was with really, really advanced reagents that they're basically the experts in. You know, your ion exchange, your solvent extractants. They were leading proponents of that, and they still have some of that technological base. For us, it's beryllium mining. We're about as good as it gets at it. Why? We have one of the biggest deposits in the world, and we've been mining it probably now for about 60 years. So we've got that down. Now, second question, can we learn? It's always a maybe. When you deal with export controls, especially for technology, that can get really, really dicey. The example that I like to give to everyone is semiconductors, right? So the supply chain for semiconductors right now is such that the Dutch have ASML, the Germans have Zeiss and all of the optics, and then the actual manufacturers themselves are the Taiwanese. So as a result of that, you have the rest of the world who's basically excluded on some level. And as a result, I can give you a textbook and you can figure out how to make a semiconductor within reason. It's probably going to be an older generation. It's probably not going to perform as well. And you're probably going to do a lot of trial and effort to get there. I mean, that's what the Chinese with SMIC are dealing with. But to get that cutting edge, to get that most advanced, that's where it gets really, really tricky. And in terms of mining, yeah, we could probably figure out how to do copper better. Yeah, we could probably figure out how to do cobalt better. But is it going to be cutting edge? I don't think so. And in mining, where a 1 or 2% difference can be the difference between a profit-bearing system and one that doesn't do anything, yeah, it's super, super critical to have a robust system that is at that edge.
Yeah, and to your point, the margins there sort of explain why China and Russia, I think, ascended to such a dominant position. We have a few more minutes. What was on your mind? I know you mentioned you wanted to chat about a couple things. I don't want to hog the question.
Yeah, no. I mean, you brought up a great point earlier, which I think needs to be expanded on a little bit. What are recent deposits? What are good sources? Especially now that we're looking at a multi-dimensional world where certain groups have certain allies, certain groups have other allies. the growing renaissance of we have this deposit now, I suspect is only going to get stronger and stronger. And the more segmented the world becomes, the more fragile the hand-holding between groups is, the more of these deposits you're going to begin to see pop up more and more, right? Like I mentioned in the last podcast, the U.S. has basically a ton of metals. But if we need some better deposits, or if we need something else, you can go talk to Canada. You can go talk to Mexico. They're on decent terms with us. Thank you, NAFTA. But for the rest of the world, Europe is an interesting one for me, because they do have deposits. They also have some of the strictest environmental regulations in the world. Well, so their immediate vicinity, who they could, in principle, do this similar arrangement with, is Russia. Not looking so promising right now. Mm-hmm. Northern Africa depends on the country that you choose to do work with. And so you get these real tenuous alliances, and then every now and then when something critical comes up, everyone suddenly looks back into their old maps and starts figuring out, well, what do we actually have? And good example of this, lithium mine just north of Prague suddenly came up again. Well, why? They've known about that deposit. They've been mining that deposit for over 100 years. Well, it's now because lithium is in high enough demand to justify opening a mine just north of Prague. I really hate distilling it to, I will go after exactly what I need, but that's sort of what's beginning to occur now more and more and more, as you have all of these different countries, Indonesia and Philippines now looking at export controls on all their nickel. Suddenly everyone's looking at all their nickel inventories, and old mines that were not accessible or mines that weren't useful are now actually coming back online. There's a nickel mine in Madagascar that was turned on fairly recently, and that facility was built a decade and a half ago, hemorrhaged money, shut down, and now all of a sudden the nickel market is good enough for them to go after it again? Well, it's because the nickel is being used now for specialty applications like your lithium batteries. So whenever you have that disruption that occurs, then suddenly everyone has to look internally and say, okay, if X happens and Y happens and we lose access to that, what can we do?
Well, and that's such an important point, because it doesn't seem to me like market forces are going to fix this, because in between now and the change, you're going to have such massive disruption. Like, entire economies depend on access to these materials and things like that. So unless you're going to have a government that is going to say, hey, we're going to make it a strategic priority and we're going to subsidize or do whatever we need to do in terms of controls or tariffs to build that kind of domestic industry. I mean, like you said, 1% to 2% can be the difference between profitability and non-profitability. And it doesn't seem to me a coincidence that China, which doesn't have to worry about profit as much, maybe more so now, but hasn't had to recently, Russia, I mean, these are countries where they don't worry about profit. It's more like, no, top down, like we've decided that we want to be sort of the country that has the strategic foothold, and therefore everything kind of comes from that. So I don't know. It just seems like that disruption, that change is going to feel kind of like whiplash, because I also feel like there's this thing happening where everybody's talking about this right now, but when you actually look at the data where people are sourcing things from, hasn't really changed that much. I mean, my favorite example for this is Japan, in 2010 woke up to the Chinese potential export controls on rare earths, and then China eventually withdrew them, and Japan said, we're going to make it a huge priority. We don't want to be dependent on China for rare earths anymore. And they went from something like 95% dependence on China in 2010 to, I think it's around 53 or 54% this year. And you can look at that two different ways. Either, well, that's good, Japan made some major changes over the course of the past 13 years. But it's also, okay, it took Japan, one of the most single-minded, focused countries in the world, it took them 13 years to cut their dependence on China by half. I mean, like, how long is it going to take the rest of the world to cut their dependence on these other things and build these own indigenous and domestic supply chains? So I don't know, it just feels like there's a lot of disruption coming this way, and that I don't really understand how market forces are going to deal with it on their own, especially with so many different actors out there that are not behaving in accordance with market forces.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a really, really good point there. And I think one way to think about it is just exactly what you said. You need this grand unifying vision democracy be damned in a sense. We are going to do this. And you do see it in certain places. So again, Indonesia has a good chunk of the world's, I'd call them easily accessible nickel reserves. Well, it is in their best interest to take a hit right now and build up the nickel infrastructure, because what are you going to do about it? And so when you get to more classic free-thinking open market economies and the countries associated with them, it gets a little bit dicier, because you don't necessarily have that grand unifying vision. You don't necessarily have that ability to say, for the next 10 years, we're just going to do this. And as a result, everyone, when these restrictions hit, they just panic. And then someone goes, well, what do we do? They turn to the mining companies. The mining companies go, the margins on that, the size of that market's so tiny, why would I even think about it? So now all of a sudden you've got all these junior miners rushing around to try to plug these gaps, and you have all these government groups saying we have to figure this out. And then suddenly the status quo kind of normalizes, and I guess it didn't actually hurt that much, so we'll just keep going as is. Or just one day it's like, no, it's just completely gone. And then people just start panicking in a sense. Yeah. It is really, really fascinating, because it's this confluence of government policy, it's this confluence of market forces, but it's also the technology and the population base who are able to actually address the problem. It's great if you're willing to put all the resources behind it, but in the case of the U.S., when you're behind 30 years, well, I'm not going to get miners who can instantly fix my problems in the next 2. So what is our long-term overreaching strategy for something like that? And the Biden administration put the first cogs into motion. They sunk in a ton of money into mining and metallurgy educational programs on the university level. But realistically, it's going to take about a full decade before we get it properly under our feet and start moving forward again. And by that point, who knows what the political forces are going to say.
Yeah, and it could also stall technology on the other end too, because to your point, like hydrogen technology looks really like it's in a really great position. But if you need PGMs for hydrogen electrolysis and all those other things, well, maybe like technology there will grind to a halt until we have enough PGMs. Everybody's talking about artificial intelligence these days, but the amount of power you're going to need for artificial intelligence, not to mention the semiconductors and the chips that go in there and things like that, like how are you supposed to do all these things that they're talking about with artificial intelligence if, to your point, technologically from a mining perspective, from the things we all take for granted, we're 30, 40 years behind, like you would think that eventually we're going to grind to a halt there on that score. So that's a pretty sobering thought.
Yeah, and one thing to keep in mind as well is that as these issues become more and more prevalent, at some point, and this is the hard point I'm having judging at the moment, where does the impetus on the market become so powerful that we have to start solving the problem, right? So one example, Tesla, Musk and his group are quite forward thinking in that sense. They're building their own battery cathode facility. They're trying to develop a relationship with the mines who would mine the nickel directly, who mine the lithium directly. They're building out their own infrastructure. Why? Because it's in their best interest to have this full network planned out so that they can reduce the price on their EVs as much as possible. In the grand scheme of things, is the price of an internal combustion engine setup versus EV, how's that going to work out? Can't tell you at the moment, but what I can tell you is Musk is giving Tesla the best chance that they have to keep their prices down, to have secured supply. And that's another big thing with these larger firms. It's not just the price, it's availability. It's great that I have 99% of a car complete, but a car doesn't work if it's not 100% complete. So if I have that last 1% when everyone else is left out in the dark, all of a sudden I'm the only person in town. I can charge whatever the heck I feel like.
Are there any other companies like Tesla that you would categorize as forward thinking from that point of view that you think are trying to really vertically integrate in the way that you're talking about?
You're starting to see it more and more slowly. GM just started making the first steps with their relationship with MP Materials. Again, rare earths right now are the hot commodity that people think about because, again, the supply is so strange. The supply is so restricted. Going one step out, Materion could qualify for that one as well because of the beryllium mine and they've got the whole beryllium supply chain vertically integrated, so soup to nuts for them, and then they can sell or they can make the specialty beryllium applications themselves. So they're not beholden to that, and that's done them pretty well for the past 60-ish years. Let's see. Another one, and this one's a bit more loosey-goosey in a sense. You're starting to see semiconductors do it as well. Because for them, it is not the scarcity of the material per se, but the scarcity of the material that is for their application. So to generalize it, really, really high purity silicon is what they need for semiconductors. The bulk market for silicon is just enormous. Metallurgical grade silicon is made in huge foundries. But the amount that semiconductors actually need is just a fraction of that. So it's in their interest to have that whole supply chain secured, because as we saw with the chip shortage during COVID, all of a sudden, one part dries up, one reagent dries up, one process dries up. The whole chain just doesn't work anymore. So now a lot of these semiconductor firms, NVIDIA, AMD, TSMC, they're ensuring that their supply chains are robust. May not be necessarily with a metal. They do have a lot of specialty organics and polymers, but it's in their interest to make sure that that entire chain is as secure as possible, because when the next bump hits, they don't want to stop selling product.
Yeah. Tomás, I could talk to you all day, but unfortunately we have to leave it there. But we will bring you back on soon. And congrats on winning the Victor Wembanyama sweepstakes. I'm sure that your life has changed appreciably as a result, and look forward to having you as a snarky Spurs fan in addition to your insights on mining as we go forward.
Well, I appreciate that. And up for the first time in a while, I'm looking forward to the basketball season, because Pop just signed for another 5 years, and we'll see where this goes. I'm cautiously excited.
You should be. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidents Podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.